Howdy, this is Mackenzie Franklin from SideGame LLC here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Today we're continuing our board games we've been playing series. This is episode 11, where I talk about some different games, mini reviews, or maybe just some discussion topics within those games and my experiences with them. All of these games will be detailed at the very end, and I'll go through all of the unique titles that I also played at the very end of the video. If you have any questions about any of these games, please let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your responses to some of the questions that I ask here, or the discussions that we have in general. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please make sure that you do. It is the best way to help us grow, and for those of you already subscribed, thank you so much for the continuous support. Let's get talking about some games. The first game I want to talk about is Fantasy Realms. This is an excellent hand management filler game where you're simply drawing cards from a deck or a face-up area and then adding it to your hand and then deciding what card to discard into that face-up area. You're using a variety of cards for all sorts of fun combos and making interesting decisions based on what you want to push your luck, and a lot of cards give you the option to do some crazy scoring opportunities, and I think it's so fun to chase down and see how high of a score that you can get. I really love the simplicity of the gameplay, but the deep nature of the different scorings and the relationships that the cards have with each other. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this game in particular was a question that I had for all of you. Now, the question is, when is it okay to remove components in a game? When is it okay to add your own house rules and modify the experience as a whole? I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, and let's go into detail as to what brought this up. When I played Fantasy Realms recently, I played a friend's copy. He took out one of the cards in his copy, and that was Protection Rune. Now, this Protection Rune is pretty straightforward. It's worth 1 strength, which means it's almost worth nothing by itself, but it clears the penalty on all of the other cards, which means that if you have some big nasty card like this Basilisk here, 35 base strength, pretty powerful, but its penalty is it blanks all these other types. With that Protection Rune, you no longer have to worry about it. He justified his reasoning to removing this card was because when it shows up, he would make sure that he got it, or if the other person saw it, they would keep it, because it was a pretty easy way to guarantee some solid points. Yes, it decreases your hand size by 1, but it gives you that ability to ignore those pretty negative effects in the form of penalties. So those were the reasons that the Protection Rune was removed, but I think that there are so many other reasons to keep it in, and that has to do with the core balance of the entire Fantasy Realms experience. The whole idea of the game is you're going to be collecting cards in a hand and deciding how they work with each other. And a lot of cards are dependent on the type, the suit, the strength of the card itself, and Protection Rune fits a lot of those different niches. Now, this is a 1 strength card that's an artifact, and some cards will care about those tags, those suits. One card in particular is this Gem of Order here. This cares if you have a run of numbers in your hand. If you're getting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, excellent. You get an extra 150 if you get 7 in a row, which is amazing. And the Gem of Order itself is a 5, so you're probably going to be picking up these lower numbers. Now, this artifact here in particular, the Protection, is a 1, so this is a pretty key number if you're trying to collect for that run. And without it, it's going to make this card significantly weaker, the Gem of Order. In addition, cards like the Basilisks here also have suits and tags and things that they work with. They are beasts. They also work with other characters that care about them. With the existence of the Protection Rune, other people are going to be taking these large point value cards, whereas you have the Beastmaster here who clears the penalty on all the beasts. This also blanks those negative effects from those powerful cards. So I'm thinking that if you're removing the Protection Rune, you're just increasing the strength of the Beastmaster, and then the Beastmaster replaces it as the card that you're always taking because, hey, if I get this, I can ensure that I get all of the rest of the cards that have these terrible negative effects in the form of beasts. With the existence of the Protection Rune and the Beastmaster in the same game, if 2 players are collecting them, there is now competition for these high power cards with big penalties, and I think that's pretty important in the game, making sure that you're keeping the competition. With the new expansion, Fantasy Realms The Cursed Horde, we had an introduction to some new classes and new types and new suits, and I thought that these were awesome. We have the Outsider cards, which give you some crazy push your luck mechanisms, as well as new bonuses and new things to chase after for crazy scoring potential, and I really like their addition to the game. However, this person also removed some of these Outsider cards, deeming that they didn't like them. And once again, this is fine. They didn't like the gameplay experience. It was a situation that they didn't enjoy, but I do think that it is important to keep these. And once again, this has to do with the suits and some of the new characters. The Undead in particular, and this one is actually affected by the Protection Rune and the Outsider cards, they all get effects based on the number of cards that are in the face-up discard area. All of a sudden, you are taking out the ability and the power level of other cards in the game. Because every suit is so integral to every other suit, you cannot take out one card in a system like this without affecting so many other cards. All of a sudden, the Spectre is weaker because there are less Outsiders and artifacts in the pool, and that means that other cards that interact with undead or maybe give you multipliers for the undead in your hand are also going to be weaker because you don't want to use the Spectre. Taking out one card or even a set of 5 cards is going to dramatically change the balance of the game, and it's going to force you to pretty much ignore specific types of cards, and I think that this really takes away a lot of the freedom from a game like Fantasy Realms. I think the best part of Fantasy Realms is that you can go for crazy combos, and it's up to you to make that choice. When cards are removed and significantly drop the power level of other cards, it becomes a non-choice when you see a card like the Spectre and say, oh, I would keep this, however, there are like 6 missing outsider and artifacts, and I don't really want this because I know that I'm not going to score a lot of points off of it. It becomes quite an issue. And we see this in some other games too. So one game I want to talk about in particular is Terraforming Mars. In this game, you're going to be playing cards in order to affect the planet and try to raise all of the global parameters to fully terraform it. And some of these cards are take that cards. You play them and they do something negative to an opponent. It's kind of an out of place mechanism, but it makes sense in the context because you're literally bringing in an asteroid into the atmosphere and it's going to destroy some things on its way. Now, some people actually remove these cards from the game, and I think that's a terrible idea. Now, the first thing that you want to look at is the cost of the card. This card actually has a space tag, which means you can use titanium to play it. If you remove these cards from the game, all of a sudden the titanium resource becomes less valuable. You're not going to want to build it because there are less cards to actually play using it. And that is a huge deal with the rate at which you draw cards in Terraforming Mars. You're only getting them at the end of the round, so if there's less cards to actually use your titanium on, you're going to pretty much ignore that strategy because it's no longer going to be as viable because that's where a lot of your points are going to disappear from. The other thing has to do with the tags on the cards, the event tag. There are many cards that will revolve around events. Less of the take that events, less abilities that those will trigger. And the last thing has to do with the global parameters. These global parameters increase the terraforming rating of many different things at the same time and at an instant. And this is very important for the game because that is the end game trigger. If these disappear, the game length is going to extend dramatically, and there's not going to be as much tension when it comes to actually playing these cards and racing up the different tracks and trying to achieve those different bonuses. There's a lot of trickling effects that happens from removing a single subset of cards, where I would say if you don't like to take that in this game, just play Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition. It retains a lot of the card play and a lot of the engine building, but there are no take that cards, but they still retain the costs, the tags, etc. So that is my recommendation for this. Do not remove these from your game. The last cards that I want to talk about are the Crane and the Architect from Everdell. Now the Crane here is a very powerful tool that some people, including myself, don't really like in the game. If you get it early, you can get rid of it to play a card at a significant discount, which is pretty important for building and developing that early engine. Now I don't remove it from the game though, because I think it's pretty important because of what it does and the different synergies it provides. First off, it's a blue card, which is going to be useful for other card effects. It's also linked to some of the events and some of the special events that you can gain during the game. You also have a connection here to the Architect. If you have the Crane, you can build the Architect for free. So if you remove one of these things, it's going to affect all of these others. It's a little bit more blatant here with the synergy to the Architect. But if you also remove the Architect, that's also going to trickle down and affect things that care about its symbols, its cost, etc. There are so many different things and different ways that it's affected, and I think that it's important to talk about. So now I give this question to you. Is it okay to remove cards from the games that you're playing? How do you make sure that it's not fundamentally changing the gameplay experience and affecting so many other parts? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and if you do any house rules or if you've done this yourself. Our next game is Dune Imperium, a race to 10 victory points in a deck-building worker placement style that has a big focus on a central conflict that's going to have a variety of payouts and rewards, but also tension in the cards that you're adding to your hand, using to play onto the board, as well as holding for your reveal turn for a bunch of bonuses. With the addition of the Rise of Ix expansion, Dune Imperium has actually reached a 10 status for me. I think that they've taken this core, extremely well-developed system, and now that they've fleshed it out with this new expansion content, there's been a lot of creativity and excitement that's been injected that I think elevates it to that 10 level experience. There are a lot of changes in the new expansion, but the biggest change has to be the board. And this is actually going to go on top of your main game board and have an additional sideboard as the planet of Ix. Now, Ix here offers new technologies and new spaces to develop dreadnoughts, and I think that this is absolutely wonderful. It gives you new avenues to spend your Solari as well as your Spice, and it makes Spice that much more important. You now have tension as to where you want to spend it. Do you save it for these larger abilities? And I love the idea of acquiring new special abilities and powers that are unique to yourself. There are also tags on these new technologies that'll give you instant effects, which can be equally as important. The other board introduces the shipping track, which gives you some great options when it comes to waiting versus reward now, as well as giving you some reason to get influence in the Spacing Guild. There are amazing choices that come into play with these tech tiles, as well as benefiting yourself and others with that shipping track, and the symbology appears on a lot of other components. The introduction of new leaders, combat cards, and entry cards also has a lot of the symbology from the tech as well as the shipping track, so it makes it so that it feels very well integrated into the experience as a whole. And the last big thing that I want to talk about are the addition of new cards. First one is a new starting card, the Control the Spice card, and this has to do when you play the large, epic multiplayer game. And this is amazing. I love that it's going to have you pushing out onto the yellow spaces, collecting spice, and gives you a way to cull your deck from those first 2 cycles of your deck, and I think that's really important. This is such a cool option, and it gets you having some disgusting turns very quickly, and I think that's really satisfying. The new Imperium row cards in addition are excellent. I love the fact that they're using the symbols from the expansion as well as pre-existing symbols in not only their play effect but also their reveal effect, and I think that just makes the choice of whether to use them to visit spaces on the board or to hold them that much more important, and I love this decision because both are good options. Some of the cards even are very small in what they do, and I think that they're done so well. Like this Chome Delegate here has this great effect of just get 3 cash, which is pretty awesome if you're cycling pretty consistently, you're getting that passive influence. But others like the Web of Power here give you some great flexibility in how you want to pursue using it. For example, based on the number of influence you have in these different areas, you're going to get an additional effect, but you are locked in to making sure you visit the Bene Gesserit with it. So many great things that are happening with the cards, whether you keep them or whether you pass with them. I think a great way to sum up my feelings of the new expansion for Dune Imperium has to be a question that I was asked. My friend Ashley said, "Hey, what's a good space on the board?" This was her first time playing. And I had to think for a second and say, I think they're all really good. It's up to you and what you want to do in this world. And I think that is awesome. Every single choice I make in Dune Imperium is tense, exciting, and the new cards allow me to pick specific options and strategies and then see how they fare during the game. I've had a lot of awesome turns, bombastic plays happen in Rise of Ix's new content, and I'm just so excited to play more of this. Welcome to the 10s, Dune Imperium. The next game that I want to talk about is Zombicide 2nd Edition, the latest entry in the Zombicide universe as you take a team of survivors and defeat a whole horde of zombies, leveling up your abilities, but the zombies will level up with you. The reason I wanted to talk about Zombicide 2nd Edition in particular was that Ariana and I actually finished the Washington ZC expansion recently. Now this expansion is pretty great. I really love the introduction of the new mechanisms, and the big one here has to do with the all-out mechanism. A lot of these cards will have this effect that says, hey, this +3, it's got this red here, and this says that you get to roll that many extra dice when you attack with it. However, when you do, if you roll a 1 on the all-out dice, those extra dice you're rolling, your weapon or thing will break. And it's pretty scary when that happens when you're in the middle of a fight. So you have to be very careful in how you're actually using this system, but I think it's done extremely well. In addition, the characters that are introduced in the expansion themselves have all-out actually tagged to a lot of their different abilities and skills. So it's pushing you to actually use those all-out mechanisms in order to actually progress and use your effects and get some advantage on the game. At the end of every round, you'll also roll to keep all of these items, and you could potentially carry over, which lets you launch forward into the next chapter with an extra bonus. And I think this is really, really well done. There's also some new decks of cards, including the Secret Services here, and these give you some new items that I just think are a lot of fun and very thematic. And then you also have the objective cards that are introduced in each scenario. This will give you a little bit of story blurb on the back. You have to take an action to reveal them, and something will happen that is thematic to the story. Not going to spoil anything here, but they are great. And the last mechanism here that I really liked is the light mechanic. There's now a new dial that actually indicates the time, and based on the time of the day, this is going to tell that if you can actually use your weapons effectively. Melee is going to be always fine because you're in the moment, you're right there. Your guns, however, are only going to hit on 6s because it's a bit harder to aim in the dark, which is really cool because it introduces new things like night vision, light sources, and it's going to make some of the items in the original game things that you're going to be wanting to search after. Now let's go on to some of the things I didn't really like in the expansion. First off were the campaign sheets. During the game, you're going to be collecting this experience, and I felt that it was a bit too infrequent with the rate at which you were getting new powers and abilities. You only got them during your 2nd, 5th, 8th experience point, and you were only getting one small ability at a time. It makes sense because there were a lot of missions, but I felt like the rate at which we were leveling up was a bit infrequent, because at the end we only had about 3 abilities each, so we only got about halfway into that experience track. If you wanted to get more XP, you would have to wait and farm XP, and that wasn't something we were really interested in doing. The last thing I wanted to mention was the game felt too easy. I never really felt like I was in danger unless I deliberately put myself in danger by making poor decisions during my gameplay. A lot of the time this was for thematics, like I was going after a person or trying to get a weapon or trying to be a hero, but it was never really appropriate if we were doing this for full strategy. I never felt like I had to do something or I had a choice and I could potentially be in danger if something went out poorly. It was all my own doing if I ever had a negative or threatening experience. So those are my thoughts on the Washington ZC expansion for Zombicide 2nd Edition. I really enjoyed the experience, and Ariane and I liked it so much that we're going to start the Fort Hendricks one here pretty soon. It's a great time getting to know these characters, and I think the All-Out system and the Night system add some great choices and great decisions when using your abilities and effects. Some cool stuff happening here. If you do want to make the game a little bit harder, then you can include the Danny Trejo expansion. It introduces a new zombie type and the Trejo Abomination, and I think that these will increase the difficulty just a bit, and that might be something that you're looking for. But overall, great experience. I really like the expansion for Zombicide Washington ZC. The next game I want to talk about is Stellar. This is actually recommended to me by my friend Dan over at Chairman of the Board. My friend Wade had a copy of it, and he showed me how to play it. And the game is really interesting as it features this great pairing mechanism, where on your turn, you're going to be taking one of these cards that's face up in this row over here into your hand, and then playing a card in your hand into your area in front of you. You either play it into your scoring area or into your night sky area, which is this large pyramid here. Based on the one that you play, a card from that center row that matches the number is going to get played into the opposite area. So everything has this really cool relationship to each other, and it's up to you how you want to use that relationship. But you have a hand size, so you can kind of combo and chain turns and save cards for later, and I think this is a great system as you're waiting to see that row of cards fill up. Great choices here. One thing I did want to mention here, and I wanted to know if you've had an experience with it, has to do with the end game scoring. Now, I went second in the game, and that meant that I got the last turn of the game, and I can also see where my opponents were playing cards throughout the experience. Now, one of the core mechanisms here is at the end of the game, based on these different sections, you're going to score additional points if you have more numbers than your opponent, so you're winning those majorities. You have these little numbers in the upper left corner that will help contribute to the strength. Since I was going second, I got to see whenever the first player completed these majority areas, so I was always able to win them by 1 or 2 extra points, or tie them if I just needed symbols on something else. And I thought that this was really interesting. I felt like I was way too strong as a second player because I had so much control over this, especially with the hand size, as I was able to collect cards and put them into specific areas. What do you think? Have you experienced this with the game? I felt that it felt a little bit too strong as the second player, and talking to my friend Wade, he said that he had some experiences with this as well, that the majorities were really the biggest swingy factor, particularly because it's a 2-player game. I'm curious to know what you think on this, but I think that the game system itself is really cool. It's really fun. I love the way that the cards are connected to each other, and it's one that I'm excited to play again. The last game I want to talk about is my favorite competitive dexterity game. This is Junkart. Now, this game has you playing as artists who are traveling around the globe collecting all these fans by showing off your different art pieces in different locations. Now, each location has its own special scenario, and I love this about this game. Every time you play, you're going to pick out 3 randomly, and they'll have their own special rules. Some of them have you playing and trying to knock down things, some have you playing in a central area and all building on one piece, and some have you moving around the table. It's so interesting. I love the different elements that are introduced in the games and how you can customize it to your experience. Now, the thing I want to talk about in particular is something that actually shows up in some other games that I really enjoy, and those are universal rules and mechanisms that tie all of the different scenarios together. You actually see this in other games like Root, where there's the movement and the combat that are all the same no matter who you are, and that exists in Junkart too, just in a different way. The first thing that is shared is the deck of cards. In a lot of the scenarios, you're going to be using this deck of cards, and that's going to determine the pieces. This is great because it gives everybody an idea of, oh, this relates to this is how I use this, and I love that it's just this shared mechanism that exists in pretty much every scenario, and I really like that. The other thing has to do with the fallen pieces and the pieces themselves. You're going to get comfortable, and you're going to get to know these pieces, be able to move them, adjust them, and understand their impact in the different mini games, and I think that's wonderful. The bases are also universal, but you even have some choice when it comes to keeping those horizontal or vertical based on the challenge presented. And the other things I want to talk about are fallen pieces and moving pieces. When it's your turn, whatever you have in your hand, the piece or the card that you're using, that is your active piece. You're going to be using that to manipulate the other pieces in front of you. And I think that's so interesting. You can never touch the other pieces. You can only touch the active piece, but I love that you can push other things to actually have some choice and modification. Very cool. However, if something besides your active piece falls on the table, it becomes a fallen piece. And based on the scenario that you're playing, you may have to do different things with fallen pieces. But I love that they keep the terminology the same between the different scenarios, because a fallen piece could mean one thing in one scenario and one thing in another. This is great for making these mini games easy to learn and for keeping the game accessible and approachable. I really enjoy Junk Art, and I think it does a great job with the shared mechanisms, and it's my favorite competitive dexterity game. So those are the games from the last couple of weeks that I wanted to talk about. Let's go ahead and share that entire list of 36 unique titles. High Society, Three Sisters, Ice Cool, Silver and Gold, Lost Cities, Railroad Inc., Vagrant Song, Twice as Clever, The Game, Face to Face, Mercurial, Dune Imperium, Coconuts, Raiders of the North Sea, Glass Road, Godzilla, Ka-Ching, Bullet Heart, Jab, Hadrian's Wall, Zombicide 2nd Edition, Mind Management, Marvel Champions, El Grande, Capital X2 Generations, Cloudspire, Blood Bowl Team Manager, For Science, Fantasy Realms, Arc Nova, Brass Birmingham, Blood Rage, Stellar, Ascension Tactics, the miniatures deck building game, Isle of Cats, Explore and Draw, Medium, Junk Art. If you have any questions about any of these games that I just listed, please let me know down in the comments below. What do you think of these things that I talked about? Do you have any concerns or comments, any ideas, or anything you'd like to share about them? I'd love to hear what you have to say. But thank you so much for watching SideGame Strong.